Hey everyone, Jody here, just letting you know that this is a recent favorite episode of This Day. We're running a couple of these to give ourselves a little bit of a break as we plot out the new year's worth of episodes. We will be back very soon with new episodes, but for now, enjoy and see you soon. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This is the first of a 4-part special that we are doing. We were originally just going to record one episode looking at some of the findings from the Church Committee hearings in 1975 and then the report in 1976, which investigated and exposed in many ways lots of covert activity by the NSA, FBI, and CIA, shady activity abroad, spying at home, mind control, good stuff like that. And then we realized, wow, there is so much here. Let's blow this out. Let's have our own version of wall-to-wall hearings. These were broadcast on TV, after all, which we will get into. So here we are, a 4-part series looking back at all we learned in 1975, which some people have called the year of intelligence, which I don't think anyone would say about 2022, or I don't know if you could say that about any year in American history. But nevertheless, 1975, they called it the year of intelligence, certainly intelligence revelations. I will explain sort of the structure of this series in a moment, but here to help guide our Church Committee miniseries are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our ride-along for this series is special guest Rick Perlstein, historian and journalist and author of many incredible books that chronicle a lot of this era, particularly the rise of modern conservatism. Before the Storm, Nixonland, The Invisible Bridge, Reaganland. Did I miss any, Rick?
Did you get 4 of them?
I got 4 of them. Check.
Unless I wrote one, that I don't remember.
And I know you're deep in working on the 5th, and so thank you for taking time with this. By the way, your books, they're very good. I've read them, but great titles too, and I want to commend you on that. Before the Storm, Nixonland, The Invisible Bridge, Reaganland. There's a great title for our miniseries out there, by the way. This was Nikki's idea.
Unlike your colleagues, I'm writing for the cruel, cold marketplace. So branding is super important.
So, Nikki, what's your idea for branding on this miniseries?
It's got to be a play on church, right?
It was yours. Oh no, it was yours. The Family Jewels.
No, that's what they were actually called, the Family Jewels.
I know, but for our series, I think the Family Jewels is a great name for a miniseries.
I love it. I think it absolutely should be called the Family Jewels.
We're planting our flag now for this being, I don't know, I feel like we'll get through this, but I think this could also be a longer book or a longer podcast series or a miniseries or whatever, because there is so much to get into. The Family Jewels, of course, the name of a lot of these, one big tranche of these documents that revealed particularly foreign meddling. But before we get into it, let me just frame how we are going to do this series. So the first episode, we're going to set the scene for what the Church Committee was, of course, and then we will do our basic episodes around some basic themes. So we're going to call it Meddling Abroad, which is foreign interference, Meddling at Home, spying on people, Meddling in Your Mind, which is the MK Ultra and other mind control stuff, and then Meddling in the Press, which is propaganda and the relationship between these agencies and journalists, and then we will wrap it up as well. So 4 episodes: Meddling Abroad, Meddling at Home, Meddling in Your Mind, Meddling in the Press. But Rick, before we get into foreign interference, in general, does the Church Committee appear in your books?
Oh yeah. I'm holding up my book, The Invisible Bridge, which covers the years 1973 to 1976, and it's kind of peppered throughout, as you can see, but it really fits the theme of that particular book, The Invisible Bridge, which opens with this epigram that Nikita Khrushchev said to, of all people, Richard Nixon, when they met, in the same trip where they did the famous kitchen debate. And Nikita Khrushchev said to Nixon, he gave him basically some political advice about how to, be a good authoritarian. If the people believe there's an imaginary river out there, you don't tell them there's no river there. You build an imaginary bridge over the imaginary river.
Wow.
And what this third book of mine kind of was about was the trauma of, Watergate, the loss of Vietnam, the Church Committee, assassinations, violence. And the response of the American people, which I found pretty salutary, this kind of reckoning with the myths of American innocence. And of course, obviously, the Church Committee is exactly straight down the middle of that new trend.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the narrative of the book is this is when Reagan, for this actually second presidential campaign, he also did in 1968, a short one, when he, ran for office against Gerald Ford for the nomination, for the Republican nomination, basically that his entire presentation to the public was this kind of permission he gave them to retreat back into those myths of American innocence.
Mm.
So he basically invites Americans to kind of cross the invisible bridge, nothing to see here. And he actually plays a small role in this church committee narrative, which began, of course, with the Rockefeller Commission, which we can get into.
That's really great political context where the country is at, which we should dive into. Let's get some basics out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
Who is church? What's
Right.
this committee up to?
Yeah, let's rewind. Actually, it covers 3 calendar years. Right around Christmas of 1974, Seymour Hersh, who's obviously one of the great truth tellers of this period, had been a great Watergate investigator, and before that, broke the story of the My Lai massacre. So this great shatterer of myths of American innocence came out with this massive front page New York Times article, thousands and thousands of words, about the CIA spying on Americans. And that really kind of broke the dam. And the reason Americans had been prepared for this moment was because the CIA was, all over the Watergate investigations, right? It turns out that, Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate ringleaders, had been a CIA guy. They went to the CIA for their equipment. And so when this came out, that they were spying on, groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Urban League, and possibly even, members of Congress. There were, 28 follow-up articles, and Gerald Ford, of course, who had taken office proclaiming after Nixon's resignation, our long national nightmare is over, really had no choice but to impanel this blue ribbon commission, which just happened to include basically every member of the national security state who could be expected to have an interest in covering up this stuff.
Right.
People like John McCone, and Ronald Reagan was on it, and Nelson Rockefeller, who was the head of what they called the Committee of 30, which basically kind of oversaw the surveillance activities of the various agencies to make sure they didn't, run into each other and shoot each other by not understanding who was on which side. And one of the critics of it pointed out, I think it was a New York Times editorial, which is relevant to the story that's to come, this was like having a mafia accountant audit the mafia's books. But be that as it may, it was such a target-rich environment. The CIA had kind of so gone off on the rails, or not. That was actually one of the debates. Let's just say the surveillance activities and kind of extra legal political activities of the CIA, whether they were ordered by presidents or there was some rogue elements. That was one of the debates that opened up, was so flagrant that even the Rockefeller Committee's report was extremely damning. And in one of the metaphors that I think is pretty central to the Year of Intelligence, ended up opening Pandora's box instead of closing it. So they do impanel 2 committees, a Senate committee run by very idealistic, a very distrustful security state senator from Idaho, Frank Church. They used to have Democratic senators in the Mountain West and Great Plains who had political ambitions. He was certainly considering a 1976 run and thought it would be great to kind of nail the Republicans for, yet more abuses of power following up on Watergate. And then a parallel commission that was run by a congressman named Nedzi, but it was taken over by a very interesting character named Otis Pike. In a lot of ways, their work was even more penetrating and dangerous to the powers that be. But basically that kind of that summer of 1975 was when these televised hearings opened up with rather a bang. It was in this staged moment. The head of the CIA pulled out a poison dart gun that they used to assassinate people without a trace. And it was kind of what they would kind of call in Watergate terms, kind of the modified limited hangout. They kind of thought if they gave up this kind of stuff, maybe, this Senate committee would be satisfied and not dig too deep.
Yeah.
But lo and behold, that's not what happened.
No. And so we'll get into some of these sort of revelations and details. But one more question about the sort of political context and the sort of post-Watergate. And Nick, we've talked about this on the show a bunch, but I'm curious kind of if we have more thoughts on the appetite in the country, but then particularly also the appetite among politicians to go after the government itself in the wake of Watergate. So much of the story of Watergate, it seems to me, is about people elected officials seeing political expediency in finally turning on Nixon. And how much now then is the story of this seeing political expediency in asking some tough questions about what our government is up to?
I do think this is a moment when both political expediency and public appetite are pretty similar when it comes to digging up some of these concealed things. Because, of course, it doesn't start with Watergate. It starts with things like the Pentagon Papers and the revelation that the federal government had been lying to Americans about the Vietnam War. And then you have the stories and the leaks around Watergate. And then you have the Watergate hearings. And then you have the leaks, the Seymour Hersh article about the CIA. And so there is this sense, if you're living through this period, that to the extent that you trusted the government in the past, it seems like they're lying a lot. And the ability of political actors to come in and say, you know what? We're going to be the ones who expose this and then clean it up. You can get some traction out of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that when I think about the kind of valence of Watergate, the fact that it ended with such a neat little bow on it, right? Precisely with, this rhetoric that the system worked. We found the bad guys. We eliminated the bad guys. This nice, kind of warm, kind of avuncular fellow is now president, Gerald Ford. And I think that there was this sense among the people who were kind of advancing this that they could create a neat redemptive narrative arc. And that never really happened. And it got just kind of deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think from this idea that they could kind of wrap it up, it just became like an onion, and it really kind of, you see it in the popular culture, this idea that once you kind of scratch the bottomless murk, you get just one more layer and one more layer and one more layer. And I think the public attitude just became this kind of hardened cynicism. This is when we're beginning to see, the kind of JFK assassination conspiracy theories really kind of come to the fore. And that's when the powers that be really begin to blanch, including figures like, Katharine Graham at the Washington Post. Or a figure like William Fulbright, who'd been the first guy to really kind of challenge the Vietnam War and accuse the government of lying when it came to the Vietnam War. And they became the leading voices saying, look, if we play this string out to the end, people are just going to completely lose faith in the government itself. And, there's this fear the country will become ungovernable. This is a time when there were, 2 assassination attempts of Ford in 1 month, bombings going on, all over the place, just spiraling levels of distrust.
I think this is, for a lot of Black civil rights leaders, this is confirmation of what they had been dealing with for decades. So when you think about the CLC, when you think about COINTELPRO and the Black Panther Party.
That comes out in 1971.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even when it comes to African leadership, when you think about Patrice Lumumba, this is such a global attack on Black leadership. And it's one of those things where people know that they're being wiretapped. They know they're being listened to.
Right.
They also know to some extent that they're being infiltrated and that they're being played by the government. And yet it was really difficult to get traction on people believing them because
it was a Martha was right kind of moment in a way.
Yes.
One of the last revelations was, in fact, the absolutely chilling, poison pen letter that, probably J. Edgar Hoover himself drafted to Martin Luther King, trying to, kind of leverage him into committing suicide. And that letter came out, There's no sense of innocence after something like that.
No.
You're
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
All right, so that's all great context, and I think now we're going to kind of start our march of the specific revelations section by section. So our first section here is meddling abroad, and then we will get into meddling at home, and then meddling in people's brains, and then meddling in the press. But meddling abroad, maybe this is where that poison dart gun comes into it. But, you know, part of the revelations here, and as the New York Times said it in October of 1975, this was the first time that any United States official had publicly stated that the CIA may have tried to murder, and in this case, Premier Castro, as late as the Johnson era or in the latter part of the Eisenhower administration. And it's not just about Castro. And, you know, in these reports, we see that there were plots to assassinate or at least go after Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Castro Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, Ngo Dinh Diem in Vietnam, and Rene Schneider in Chile. I'm sure there were many others. But Kelly, any reaction to some of the details that emerge here about the foreign meddling?
I mean, the foreign meddling is so extreme that it's almost comical, right? Like when you think about the attempts that were made to take down someone like Castro, like trying to discredit him by putting salts in his shoes that would make his beard fall out, or, you know, trying to give him some sort of concoction that would make him have a personality disorder. And I mean, there are all of these, and just outright attempts to assassinate him. I mean, it runs the gamut. And I think it also shows me how much the United States is invested in maintaining its power structure, not just within the United States, but all around the world, having a hand of influence, political and economic and social influence, that I think is really also terrifying. In an age when a lot of African countries are getting their independence for the first time and have a real opportunity to sort of get on their feet after colonization, and a lot of that gets dismantled by the assassinations of political leaders that were actually progressive.
Yeah. The dilemma of these, you know, leaders of the newly liberated nations of Africa was terrible, because you had to, there was no way you could kind of proceed without, quote unquote, choosing a side, right, in the Cold War. So there's really no way without kind of becoming somebody's pawn. And there was so much paranoia within the national security state that, say, you know, taking fallow lands, you know, thousands and thousands of acres of fallow lands in a state, you know, country where people were starving, that were owned by, you know, in the case of Guatemala, you know, the United Fruit Company, that could not happen except for this idea that anyone who did it was a cat's paw in the Soviet Union, which turned out to be completely false, but it was enough to end up with the president of Guatemala, Giacomo Arbenz, assassinated.
And the same thing
on behalf of the United Fruit Company.
The same thing happens with Patrice Lumumba, when basically he says, no, we don't want bags of food. We don't want seats. Like, send us tractors, send us real equipment that will allow us to be independent. And those ideas about gaining real independence, meaning no longer being dependent upon other European countries, sends, like, you know, alarms up among U.S. officials that don't really want independence, or at least they don't want the lack of dependence. They want dependence upon the United States.
Right. And in the case of some places like Congo, there's mineral wealth, right? I mean, it's a lot of this is just corporate, you know? So they have, you know, this idea that they're not going to, you know, basically play ball and become kind of resource extraction kind of client states, you know? They're of no use to us. And then they can drop the C word, communism, and then this entire machine goes into motion, which the CIA is absolutely at the center of it.
It's so interesting to juxtapose this very serious geopolitical and economic maneuvering that's happening because of these CIA plots with the ridiculousness of the plots themselves, right? The attempting to kill Castro with exploding seashells and poisoned cigars. And ice cream. And sending his ex-lover to go murder him.
And getting the mob to do it.
Yes! It's these kinds of things that seem almost unbelievable, and then right?
The mob guy who worked with the Kennedys, the guys who are supposed to be the bright shining princes of Camelot, dies in his kitchen the day before he's supposed to testify.
Yeah.
But I think that together they give you a picture of a part of the government that has been given so much power to experiment and shape world events that both the ridiculous and these very serious moments help us see like how, I don't want to say out of control the CIA was, because I think the federal government knew pretty much what it was doing.
Yes,
but just how much power it was wielding.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the most fascinating things about both the foreign meddling but just throughout this and this entire era, which is, because look, I've long known about, and I'll tell you, one of the reasons I wanted to do this was because of all the sort of like silly Castro stories. The one I always heard, which is probably not true, is that they sent him cigars laced with LSD, and then because they thought it would make him go crazy, and then they got a note back a week later saying, "Please send more." But we're going to go ahead and say that's true, even though I don't think it was in the Church Committee report. But my question is, do all those shiny little silly stories detract from, as you're saying, Nikki, a real understanding of the deep rot and, the sort of deep project that the U.S. was up to here? And I feel like that's something that I think about with Watergate. It's something I think about with Trump, too, which is like you can get caught up in all these little shenanigans and look at all these bumbling people doing stuff. But further upstream, there was a permission structure and a kind of larger idea of we do what it takes to get our way and impose our will. And does it feel like the way this stuff came out, the little tidbits detracted from the larger story?
I think that's true. I mean, one of the things that I discovered writing about the actual publication of the report, the Church Committee report, and we get to the Pike Committee report, which is another soap opera altogether, was that it was very well written, very clear, very devastating, and pretty much ignored kind of precisely for those reasons. It was short, sharp prose. Unsavory and vicious tactics have been employed, including anonymous attempts to break up marriages, disrupt meetings, ostracize persons from other professions, provoke target groups into rivalries, just all kinds of stuff, down the road, down the line. And one of the things that was published was one of the original kind of planning documents for the CIA by a World War II fighting ace, Jimmy Doolittle. He said, long-standing American concepts of, this is from 1954, by the way, long-standing American concepts of, quote, fair play must be reconsidered. We must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective methods than they use against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. So there's kind of like, acknowledgement that, well, in order to be good, we have to be bad, which has so many resonances with, the way the Trump right thinks, the way that, the Dick Cheney's the world articulated
the
things
Robert
after
McNamara's.
2001, the Robert McNamara's, and even going back to the kind of the Alien Sedition Acts, this kind of play of innocence and experience. And this idea that America can't hack it in the world if we're really like America, so we have to become like something else. So at what point do you say, well, maybe we're not really kind of that ideal in the first place?
What I think a lot of Americans don't also realize is that, yes, I think some of those stories are distracting. The ridiculous stories are distracting. But I don't think people realize how wide and how deep all of this was, that when you have 900 investigations, thousands of little minor investigations, when you think of the fact that the NSA is like 8 times bigger than the CIA, we think of the CIA as the big bad wolf, but really the NSA is the major hand in a lot of this. And so many Americans are like, wait, what's the NSA?
When it's no such agency. Yeah, that was one of the things that came out. That was on the House side. Bella Abzug went after the NSA. And one of the things she discovered was that, Western Union, the telegraph company, was literally turning over every foreign telegram to the NSA every night. Like someone would come over, in a car and just like kind of take away cartons of these telegrams. It was, very much like the kind of thing we saw during the Bush administration with, PRISM. And it was this massive, massive web, this massive expenditure of human labor power, government funds, tax funds.
Yeah. You sort of name dropped Cheney there in passing. Cheney,
he's in there. That's right. He's part of the story.
He plays a role here. He
wanted to break into Seymour Hersh's apartment.
Yes, and he was sort of kicking around in the CIA at that time, and the NSA, and
he was the Ford. He was basically he was one of the main aides to Rumsfeld as chief of staff in the White House,
and is seen as having really tried to limit some of the scope of these investigations.
That's
and
right.
then, of course, does the same thing with Iran-Contra, and then, of course, ends up in the Bush.
Right. As a result, a direct result of this, he writes the minority report to the Iran-Contra committee's findings saying, look, basically he codifies the idea if the president does it, it's not illegal. Then he becomes vice president and says the vice president is the fourth branch of government. It's not really covered in the Constitution, so we'll do all this stuff out of my office. And it's basically this idea. It's getting back to the whole Doolittle quote. It's the idea that America should have a king. Really,
right?
No accountability.
Yeah. Okay, so we should wrap up this episode on foreign meddling. But any thoughts here as we wrap up part one?
One of the things that happened in 1975 was that a former CIA officer wrote an expose. His name was Philip Agee, really idiosyncratic guy. Academic biography just came out of him. It was called Inside the Company. And he was just kind of a low-level guy in Central America, South America. And he just wrote in very meticulous fashion about how they just decide who they want to win an election. Not just like the presidential election, like municipal elections. And they would sabotage the elections, And, what kind of finally, got him off the dime and turned him into a whistleblower was, hearing the people that they had picked, hearing screams in the next room because they were, torturing the bad guys. Right. The penetration was extremely deep, just like you say. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's wrap up part one there. That is the end of Meddling Abroad. Next episode will be Meddling at Home. But We'll do a batch thank yous. Nicole Hemmer, Kelly Carter Jackson, Rick Perlstein, thank you so much, and I'll see you next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
The committee does not believe that the acts which it has examined represent the real American character. We regard the assassination plots as aberrations. The United States must not adopt the tactics of the enemy. Means are as important as ends. Crisis makes it tempting to ignore the wise restraints that make men free. But each time we do so, each time the means we use are wrong, our inner strength, the strength which makes us free, is lessened.
Radiotopia from P